Now, the title of the conference this afternoon, as you know, is A Fairer Ireland, Equality and Rights at the Heart of Economic Recovery. And this is to explore ways in which the statutory infrastructure can strengthen the economy. And the organisers have invited the Justice and Equality spokespersons from the main political parties to join us for this debate. And we have had replies from Fine Gael, from Labour, from Sinn Féin and from the Green Party. In the case of Fianna Fáil, the Minister was not available, sent his apologies, and the Ministers of State at the Department of Justice, Equality and Law Reform were also not available to attend in the Minister's absence. So let me introduce our panel. First, Angus O'Snoddig is TD and spokesperson on Justice, Equality and International Affairs for Sinn Féin. Michael Darcy is Deputy Spokesperson on Justice with special responsibility for equality for Fine Gael. Joe Costello is Spokesperson on Europe and Human Rights for the Labour Party. And Kieran Cuff is Spokesperson on Transport, Marine and the Justice, Equality and Law Reform agenda for the Green Party. And let me call first on Michael Darcy of Fine Gael. I'll ask the panellists to be brief on this, the better, to save time for the debate. Ask Michael Darcy first, Deputy Spokesperson on Justice, to speak for Fine Gael.
Thank you, Chairman. It would be easy as we struggle to stay afloat in the current recession to take the easy option and to bleed the entire economic conversation of any humanity and engage solely in a bookkeeping exercise. That would be a terrible and possibly irreversible mistake. Recovery will, of course, have to be economically driven, but the vulnerable must be protected, and policies must be informed by fairness. If our social welfare system was inefficient and in obvious need of reform, then that was also true last year. Just because we urgently need to balance the books, and we do, we cannot impose a correction so severe on our citizens that many will go under. It is an impending reality that families will be homeless before the winter is out. This is an injustice from which we must protect our citizens. The role played by organisations established to protect the rights and interests of those who are regularly subject to discrimination, the poorly represented, or those without a voice is always difficult and often thankless. This is especially true during times of economic difficulty. Fine Gael as a party has long championed fairness in its governance of the country. Ladies and gentlemen, I am cutting my speech to bits just to keep it short, in line with the chairman. It is a fact, false economy equality organisations very often carry out work that the government either cannot or will not fund. The consequences of removing these monies will invariably see the unprotected victims falling back into the state health or welfare system. And this further highlights the government's lack of forward thinking. Providing protection to the vulnerable during recessionary times is difficult. The rising tide of the Celtic Tiger did not float all boats. The gap between rich and poor widened. What is most frightening now is the sheer number of those in Irish society who are suffering during the current downturn. Reports from St. Vincent de Paul that people who were contributing to them last year are now seeking assistance this year. Last night, St. Vincent de Paul stated they are expecting over 100,000 calls for assistance in the 4 weeks between now and Christmas. A major plank of Fine Gael's plan to overhaul the country's health system is an example of how we put people at the heart of policy. A person's health and wellness should not be dependent on their ability to pay for a service that is not working. It will take imagination, it will take a strong will, but if the economic recovery from this government is not based on the principle of fairness, then we have lost something critical, something that every member of the era fights for, and that, Chairman, is decency.
Thank you, Chairman, and thanks for the opportunity of addressing the conference. And to compliment the Equality and Rights Alliance for the work that they've been doing over this last period of time. Now, the high-profile organisations that were cut severely in the last budget was the Equality Authority, the Irish Human Rights Commission, and the National Consultative Council on Racism and Interculturalism in the Department of Justice. And they were fairly savagely cut, and a lot of people in the forefront of human rights and equality were dealt a very severe blow in that respect. But there are other areas not so well known that were equally cut by the government. For example, in the Department of Education, the Educational Disadvantage Committee was abolished entirely. That's educational disadvantage for the poor and less well-off sectors. Also the National Adult Learning Council was abolished entirely. And also the closure, the Centre for Early Childhood Development and Education, it was closed. They were totally abolished. They were done away with, and that was the Department of Education dealing with children. In the Department of Social Welfare, the Combat Poverty Agency, which was an initiative of the Irish government back in the 70s, originally, which was bought into by the European Union, now is an integral part of every European country in the European Union. That, together with the Office of Social Inclusion, was absorbed into the Department of Social Welfare. And finally, you might say that in terms of, if you like, the vulnerable abroad, the overseas development aid was substantially cut by nearly a quarter. And of course, you're dealing with the poorest of the poor. So, under the last budget, there was quite an extensive attack on equality, human rights, economic rights, the poor, children's rights, which is a very broad. It was a very broad body blow to a lot of organisations that were working in those areas. So, in the short term, from the point of view of the Labour Party, we will be seeking to ensure that any cutbacks that does take place in the context of a recession, that they will be limited to the extent that each organisation can fulfil the remit that it has, that it is not dealt such a savage blow that it's not able to function effectively. And I think that's extremely important. Secondly, I think we have to look very carefully to ensure that by absorbing organisations into either the Department of Justice, Education, Social Welfare, or any other department, that you are not undercutting and undermining the independence of that organisation to carry out its remit. And thirdly, in the context of the budget itself, we have to have a fair and equitable approach to where the cuts are going to take place. If you're going to have a levy, it's a levy that should be across the board, not a sector of the workforce, as we've had it recently. Likewise, something like the minimum wage is something that should not be hit because it's the minimum wage for people who are on the breadline. And likewise, child benefit, which is the only income that goes directly to children, is something that I believe should not be touched. So we should have equity and fairness in times of recession. In terms of the long term, I think we have to look very carefully at the review of our human rights equality architecture in the downgrading equality and human rights, assessing the impact that I've only been able to dip into by Brian Harvey and Kathy Walsh. I think it's there's never an ill wind. Just because of the recession, this might very well be the opportunity to have a fresh look at our structures in terms of human rights and equality, and also about how we conduct our business. So a thorough review, I think, would be very desirable, Chairman.
Okay,
Two more points.
Okay.
Secondly, I think we have to undermine very strongly the independence and the accountability and the funding of such organisations. And finally, and I've developed this if you wish, I do believe that the Charter of Fundamental Rights that has now been incorporated into the Lisbon Treaty is a template that gives huge scope for development of a rights-based approach to government, both here and in the other member states of the European Union.
Thank you very much.